What's your thoughts on government cover-ups or covert societies attempting to control humanity? Do you believe in ancient astronauts, intergalactic communication, or extraterrestrial visitations? Ever had an experience with disembodied spirits or the paranormal universe? Are these subjects fact or fiction? Each week, Tony and Eddie explore these unbelievable realities and beyond. Exclusively on Truth Be Told.
Hello and welcome to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm your host, Tony Sweet.
And I'm Eddie Connor. Now, Tony, I think everyone loves a magical, mystical story, and most of us want to believe that underneath great works of fiction, there might be some reflection of the truth between the pages. A great example is the story of King Arthur. But, Tony, was King Arthur just another myth, or was he true to life?
Great question, Eddie. And today, Graham Phillips, also known as the real Indiana Jones, Graham has graciously stopped by our show and to shine a light on the legend of King Arthur and to speak about his latest book, The Lost Tomb of King Arthur.
He's also been described as a historical detective and a modern-day adventurer. To learn more, go to grahamphillips.net to explore his other books. And in the meanwhile, please put your hands together and welcome our guest today, Graham Phillips.
See, I told you, Graham, the audience would love you.
See, they're crowded in here, standing around, clapping and eating cheese and crackers.
Well, thank them very much.
All right. Well, thank you, guys. All right. Well, we are so excited. You're all the way from the England. What part of England are you calling from, or Skyping in from, I guess?
Right in the middle of, actually not too far from Manchester.
Nice.
Ooh.
Nice. I've always wanted to be in that part. I've been to London.
I've never been over the pond.
Well, we'll have to go one of these
Well,
days.
they won't let me go over the pond if I keep talking like that, will they, Graham?
Right.
You don't want to come here. It's freezing cold and it's wet. Your president's here at the moment.
I know, to see the Queen.
He had dinner with the Queen today.
Wow.
Wow.
Well, didn't you just have the dinner with the Queen? No, just kidding. Well, we're excited to have you here. For the first time being on Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie, we always like to find a little bit about who our guest is. And I guarantee that Graham will be back and if he wants to come back after our experience.
I know. After we're done with him, he'll be like, I don't know.
But a lot of the books that you have written, Robin Hood and, Merlin and King Arthur and many, many books, a lot of them have been through history or myths. And that, most of us as children have read about and movies been made about. And I want to know how you got started of writing about these characters in history.
Well, when I was at college, I wanted to go on to be a journalist, but no newspapers would have me. So I had to start my own magazine off. I managed to raise the money to start a magazine because I wanted to investigate like weird and wonderful things like the paranormal. And so I started this magazine with quite a lot of backing called Strange Phenomena. This is going back 1980 or something. And I started this magazine and it kept going for a while, but I started to find that I was more interested in historical mysteries than I was in ghosts and UFOs and things. Not because I didn't believe in ghosts and UFOs and things. I certainly interviewed a lot of people who claimed to have seen these things. It's just that I was never going to get to the bottom of what these things really were. But with historical mysteries, I found that there was at least some hope of solving them. So I started to investigate those sorts of things. And eventually I wrote books about them.
And what was your first book that you chose? Well, what character, I guess, what fictional character or real life?
It started off with historical figures that were known to exist, but mysteries surrounded them. I started off kind of as a treasure hunter, really.
Oh,
there was, in England, there was, you may have heard of Mary, Queen of Scots, who had a head chopped off by Queen Elizabeth I.
Right.
She was a cousin and she was a rival to the throne. And when she died, her jewelry disappeared. And there was particular jewels that there was a series of clues left in paintings that were sealed up behind the walls of this Tudor manor house. And they were clearly clues of some kind as to where Mary Queen of Scots' followers had hidden this around the time of William Shakespeare. So there were like 400-year-old clues.
Wow.
And decided to look into those to search for the lost jewels of Mary Queen of Scots. That was the first one that I did.
Wow. And so what was one of the more compelling aspects of doing the research for that particular book?
The most compelling aspect was that the story, that the actual pictures on the wall were depicting King Arthur and his knights.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that they depicted that is because nearby there was a hill called Knight's Hill. And there was legends in that area about King Arthur. So cutting a long story short, I decided that that was the place to search for her jewels. In the end, we found a casket made of brass that was examined by museums and dated to be over 400 years old.
Wow.
And inside was a small green gemstone that had once been set in a ring of Mary Queen of Scots. So that was astonishing that we'd actually managed to, myself and the other people involved with the magazine, had managed to solve those clues that had been there for so long without ever anybody solving them before. But because I'd investigated some of the King Arthur stuff as well to try and understand what these clues in these paintings might mean, I became fascinated by the legend of King Arthur. So even though I've written many other books since about other historical mysteries, I kept coming back to King Arthur. In fact, over the years, I've done a book about Merlin, I've done a book about the Holy Grail, and now this one is the search for the tomb of Arthur, which is a kind of accumulation of like years and years of work on and off for like since then, really.
Well, I know we actually have interviewed people before. I think Ralph Ellis is one of them that talked about the Knights of the Round Table were actually, a lot of people are like, what? How is this? This is kind of crazy information, but who knows? But the Knights of the Round Table were actually the disciples of Jesus.
Well, in the Middle Ages,
Look at him like
in the Middle Ages. Here's me laughing, and at the moment I'm sitting in a cupboard without having had a shave because I didn't realise anyone would be able to see me, and I'm saying something else sounds a bit crazy. No, it's not as crazy as it sounds. In the Middle Ages, the stories of King Arthur were written down in what was known as the Arthurian romances. They were written from about 1150 until about 1450. And in those stories, the Knights of the Round Table, as we know them, were pretty much invented. And there's 12 of them, plus Arthur himself. So in the same way as you've got Jesus and his 12 disciples sitting around a table at the Last Supper, it seems that somebody at least had the idea to incorporate these kind of Christian themes into the story of King Arthur. And of course, Arthur has to go, and his knights have to go in search of the Holy Grail, which was said to have been the cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper. And when they eventually find it, they bring it back to Camelot. They put it on the table, and all the knights, the 12 knights and Arthur are sitting there, and there's the cup which miraculously heals Arthur because he's ill, and it kind of pretty much brings him back to life. And then the whole of the country, a famine that's spread throughout the land stops, and things go well for a while anyway. So there's kind of Christian themes in it, which kind of associate Arthur with a kind of new Jesus, and the Knights of the Round Table is like the disciples, and of course you've got the cup of the Last Supper. So this is Christian themes that were brought into the Arthurian story in the Middle Ages.
Wow. And so if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm Eddie Connor.
And I'm Tony Sweet.
And we have with us Graham Phillips. He's a historical detective and a real-life Indiana Jones. I just love saying that. His brand new book is called The Lost Tomb of King Arthur. It's about the search for Camelot in the Isle of Avalon. And so we want to ask you just a couple of questions for new people tuning in. Tony's fan base is expanding consistently, so that's fun. But we want to ask you right up front, who was King Arthur?
Well, the character that's portrayed in the movies these days, which has all been taken from the stories written in the Middle Ages, the man who rescued damsels in distress, fought dragons and got involved with disputes with witches and was advised by a wizard. That's an invented story as far as I'm concerned. It's a made-up medieval yarn. And of course, it became very, very popular. And many historians will say, well, that King Arthur couldn't exist, so they haven't really decided to search for a person that might be behind that legend. Well, I don't think that person exists, but there was definitely an historical King Arthur, because 300 years before those earliest Arthurian romances were composed, a British monk writing about 830 AD, he put together a whole series of manuscripts that were at his disposal then to create a book that he called The History of the Britons. And in that, he describes that around about the year 500, a man called Arthur, who he describes as the Dux or Deus Bellorum, which means leader of battles, united the British people against invasion from the Anglo-Saxons. Now, most people think of Britain as being an Anglo-Saxon country. It wasn't until this period. The Anglo-Saxons came from Germany. The native Britons, who were actually Celts at this point, at first were fighting to try and get rid of them. And the man who led this fight and was successful for a while in holding them back, according to this monk Nennius, was Arthur. But he doesn't describe him as being associated with anything magical or mystical. He simply describes him as a warrior who led the Britons and fought a series of successful battles against the Anglo-Saxons. So it seems like an historical character did exist behind the legend that later grew up around him.
Wow. So what is it, do you think, makes King Arthur so universally famous today? I mean, this has been centuries. And why
is he not forgotten like so many other historical figures?
Yeah.
In the Middle Ages, you've got to appreciate what was happening in Britain. The Anglo-Saxons invaded, then the Vikings invaded, then the Normans, the French, invaded in 1066.
Oh, my God.
Eventually, throughout the medieval period, Britain was ruled by the French, and the vast majority of people in England were Anglo-Saxons. And the Normans then conquered the Welsh, who were the descendants of the original Britons. So both the original Britons and the Anglo-Saxons, who had once been fighting each other during Arthur's time, now had a common enemy, their overlords, the French. In fact, the court of Britain, or England, Wales at the time, actually spoke French. They didn't even speak the native Anglo-Saxon, or Old English as we call it now, or Welsh. So they couldn't really communicate with people without translators. Two completely separate societies emerged. And on the one hand, you've got the common, ordinary people who needed a hero to show that they could stand up against their Norman or French overlords. And this person came about in the figure of Robin Hood.
Oh,
now, Robin Hood is said to have lived around about 1190, while Richard I was away fighting the Crusades. And the evil King John, the king's brother, Prince John as he was then, is left in charge. And Robin Hood leads us a guerrilla struggle, if you like, against the Norman overlords. Now, these stories became extremely popular amongst a repressed people. So maybe there's a real Robin Hood, and then the stories of him become more and more exaggerated. Now, at the same time, the French elite needed someone as their hero to kind of counteract this fictional Robin Hood. Now, they looked back in history. They didn't want an old Anglo-Saxon king as claiming they were descended from him because they were the people they'd conquered. But many of the French could claim descent from the earlier Celts that had fled Britain when the Anglo-Saxons arrived. And they needed a king of the Britons before the Saxons to claim descent from. So the kings of the time of England decided on the nearest figure they could find in old British history to a king, and that was the leader Arthur, who had fought and beat the Anglo-Saxons. So they Arthur was used in a medieval propaganda exercise as a king that was a great person who had beaten these Anglo-Saxons, and it gave them, if they were descended from him, the right to rule over them. And of course, once this got started, more and more people started writing popular stories and poems about King Arthur, and it just took off. So Robin Hood and King Arthur, the stories of them in the Middle Ages existed in parallel.
Well, how often we all know history repeats itself, and I'm a big fan of paranormal and New Age and metaphysics and spirituality and law of attraction, and it's easy to see how history perpetually repeats itself because we keep sometimes telling the same stories over and over and over as individuals, and then other times as mass consciousness. And how often do you think, Graham, and how fast does history repeat itself? Because in a way, you also described what was going on with Robin Hood and King Arthur back in the time, similar to what's kind of going on in North America right now and other parts of the world too.
Well, it does seem that at the moment in the world, there's this incredible split right down the middle.
Yes.
I mean, the American elections recently have been decided by just a few thousand votes out of millions of people.
Yes.
A few voters have switched one way or the other, and it's decided on which party rules. In this country, we're pretty much split down the middle too, between a socialist Labour Party and the people that support that, and a very different Conservative Party, which is polar opposites. But it's not just that. You've got religious divides.
Yes.
I mean, when I was in the 60s and there was all the hippie movement, I kind of thought religion was on its way out. But it's come back in a fundamental way that, and in ways which are totally diametrically opposed to each other. And well, what's happening today certainly was happening in the Middle Ages, when you've got one lot of people with one totally different set of beliefs to another lot of people. And Robin Hood and King Arthur kind of symbolize those different poles, if you like.
Yeah, and I think that's fascinating. Do you ever feel, this is an esoteric question to a point, but I really believe things like this. Do you ever feel, Graham, that you are being guided sometimes by a higher power or an inner knowing that would not be available to you if you weren't so pleasantly obsessed by this material?
Think, I mean, but by some of the subjects, you think he would be.
Yeah.
I mean, because a lot of people, I mean, this is subjects that we all have grown up with and love. But yeah, you've done such a great job. So I'm just saying you have to have been guided.
Yeah.
Some weird things have happened. For example, when I was looking into the mystery of the Knights Templars and the Ark of the Covenant, which they were supposed to have claimed, that was this golden chest that held the Ten Commandments according to the Bible. The Knights Templars claimed to have found it in the Middle Ages, and one legend said that they'd brought it back to Britain. It was hidden somewhere here. So I decided to look into that. And while I was trying to discover this information, I remember one particular occasion. This is giving you an example. There was, again, this is something where somebody left a series of clues. There was a stained glass window, and in that stained glass window that was left many years ago, there was a depiction of a star that seemed to be right next to where this chapel, where the Ark of the Covenant was hidden by the Templars. And so this was clues that were left as to where it was. So I thought, well, I've got to solve these clues, even if they lead nowhere. Somebody's trying to lead series of clues to somewhere. So me and a couple of colleagues spent ages traveling around this area of the British countryside, trying to see what the star might represent. At first we thought it might be a star in the sky that led us in a certain direction on a certain day. That did come into it, but later on. But we were traveling around the area, and also in this window, in this stained glass window, there was a rooster right next to this star. And we were trying to figure out what that meant. And as we were driving down this lane, we thought, nah, we're never going to find the ruins of this chapel. We had the window down of the car because it was hot. And suddenly this cockerel crows right on this fence next to us that almost made the car crash. Because oh my God, what's that? We pulled into the side of the road and we thought, what on earth? And then this cockerel flew away. And then I looked out the window, and right where we'd stopped, there was a signboard for the name of the road. and it said Star Lane.
No.
And we went
way.
down Star Lane and right there found we'd have never have gone down there otherwise, and found the ruins of this chapel. That is just one of many examples I can give you over the years where fate, don't ask me how it works, but fate seems to intervene to help if I kind of go down a wrong turn, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, see,
I
I
totally believe
love
in
things, and I also believe that when your heart's in the right place and you have an authentic desire and passion to be doing what you're doing, and you're obviously following that, I think that removes obstacles that would have normally been there.
Yeah, I think how it works, how these strange, I mean, we've even got to the point once of trying something years ago, which I described as divination by landscape. Rather than pick tarot cards or something to decide what you're going to do or throw a dice, we'd literally go into a pub, like an inn, a bar in England somewhere, if we ran out of clues, and sit there and said, right, the next person to come through that door will tell us what we have to do.
Mm-hmm.
And on one occasion, this was really, really weird. We were just sitting there, and suddenly this girl came in dressed as a jester. And we thought, what? That was the next person to the door. She was dressed as a jester. And we thought, this is absolutely ridiculous. Why? When we found that lady, she was off to a fancy dress party. But somebody said, well, could a jester be something to do with it? And it turned out that at the end, the place we were looking for was called the Jester's Tavern, which was in another town altogether.
No.
And it was only because of this person coming through the door that we were led to that.
Mm.
What,
You tell me, how does that work? I mean, you go to that woman, she's decided to go to that party weeks before, and yet when we say, right, we want some clues now, I mean, this doesn't always work, but it has on many occasions.
Wow.
We want some clues now as to where we go. And this girl comes to the door dressed like that. She's already decided who's messing around with time and reality here. It's like a quantum effect.
It is.
Did she exist before she came through that door? I'm going off the point of King Arthur here,
Right.
but I'm trying to explain that some very weird things have happened, and I can't explain them. You can't explain them by ghosts or even the intercession by higher beings. I mean, who can change the entire fabric of reality?
Exactly. I think we each do, each thought and feeling we have, and the more pure the thought and the feeling we have, the more the universe or non-physical comes in and orchestrates on our behalf. So I think it's this wonderful co-creative process. And again, you're so on point with your heart chakra with all of this. And it's funny because the next question is, how have you found King Arthur when no one else has? Well, you've answered that question. We appreciate that, Graham. So we're going to ask you this. Did Camelot really exist? And if so, where is it?
Well, one of the first things I needed to do in the search for an historical King Arthur, because obviously, according to these early texts, there was one, although he may not have been the kind of dragon hunting person we know and love today. In order to find him, I thought, well, okay, where would he, according to legend, he's supposed to have ruled from the most powerful city in the country, the capital of Britain, in 500 AD. So where was this really? Well, the three largest cities in the country at the end of Roman rule in Britain, which finished in the early 400s, were London, Lincoln, and York, which are all on the east side of Britain. Now, these were all invaded by the Anglo-Saxons from Germany, which left the fourth largest city at the end of Roman rule as the capital of post-Roman Britain, or early Dark Age Britain, as it's known. And this was a city called Viraconium. Now, the other cities, old Roman cities like London, the ruins of them are now buried beneath streets and office blocks and apartment buildings, and they can't be excavated except for very occasionally if they come across them while there's some building work going on. But Viraconium, once it was eventually abandoned in the later Dark Ages, was completely abandoned. No new city was built on top of it. And so the ruins of it still survive in open countryside, smack bang in the centre of England. And the reason it survived, at least back then, was because it wasn't overtaken by the Anglo-Saxons that early on, because it was in the centre of England and not on the east where they were invading. So I thought that sounds like the capital of Britain at the time that Arthur is said to have lived. And because it's in open countryside, it's been able to be excavated many occasions over the last 20 or 30 years by archaeologists. And they have discovered that when many other Roman cities were being abandoned for more easily defendable hill fortifications, Viriconium was not only still occupied, but it was completely refortified. And right in the middle of this city was a new palace built, Roman-style palace, a classical building. And the archaeologist says, well, this has to have been the palace of a very important warlord. Whoever reorganized the building of the city, organized the rebuilding of the city and its refortification, must have been one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, warlord or king in Britain. And the time that this was rebuilt coincides exactly with the period Arthur is said to have lived, around 500 AD. So whoever this warlord was, who built himself a palace there, seems to be the person who was the most important person in Britain at the time that Arthur is said to have been the most important person in Britain. So if you're looking for an historical Camelot, it's Viriconium, which is smack bang in the centre of England, just outside a little village called Wroxeter.
Wroxeter. I'll have to check that one out. And before we take a break, I want to ask, and everybody loves a love story, a romance, and one of the biggest romances was King Arthur and Guinevere. And could you talk a little bit about Guinevere and who she was, and was she the wife of King Arthur? So tell us how that story became.
Well, I think, unfortunately, it seems that Guinevere is someone who becomes associated with Arthur later on. In fact, the earliest references, his wife is called Guinemere. Now, Guinemere seems to have been, if you like, the historical Guinevere, or the historical wife of King Arthur. Unfortunately, historical records at that time, and most historical records during the Dark Ages, don't give women much of much space. It's all the men doing this, that, and the other. Who the women are is very, very seldom known. Who wives and daughters and mothers were. It's all about the men. So we don't know anything about Guinemere other than she's in the earliest references to Arthur as being his wife. Guinevere, or Guinevere, actually means white lady or white spirit. And in early British mythology, there was a goddess called Guinevere, this white spirit, and she was a personification of a goddess. She was like a woman who lived and breathed, according to mythology of the Britons, but was a personification of this goddess of healing and nature. So it seems that somewhere early on, the story of King Arthur got tied up with the story of a Celtic goddess.
Oh, wow. So it got combined, and then it just became part of just a story.
Yeah, so if you want to say who is the real Guinevere, well, she's a combination of presumably a Romanized Briton called Guinemere, and this Guinevere, who's a Celtic goddess who was supposed to be the most beautiful of goddesses. So that's why Guinevere is the most beautiful woman in the land. And also, the Celtic goddess, the reason she got made mortal in the early stories, in the mythology, is because she had an affair with a man whose name is Lud of the Silver Lance.
Oh.
Now, because he carried a silver lance. Now, if you remember in the story of King Arthur in the Middle Ages, the reason why the land falls into turmoil is that Arthur's most trusted knight has an affair with Guinevere, and his name is Lancelot.
Oh, yeah.
Lord of the Silver Lance, Lancelot.
Yes.
So it's a combination of a goddess story and possibly the story of a real Roman lady or post-Roman lady who would still be dressed and living in a Roman style.
Wow, this is so fascinating.
Well, I have to say, we have now, and I want to welcome everybody that's listening to us for the first time on Facebook. We're streaming live to Facebook, and the people in the UBN radio chat room, please, you guys ask questions. People are finding this very fascinating. They being on Facebook, a lot of people have not stumbled upon Truth Be Told before, so and they find you amazing, Graham. So you must be doing a pretty damn good job.
That's what we're
What,
saying.
like all those people that were clapping in the studio.
That's right. That's right. All right. So, well, we're going to take just a quick break. We have to do our sponsors real quick. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about the Excalibur, because that was a huge part of King Arthur and his history. And so we're going to be back here in just a second. But Eddie, I'm excited. This is a great show.
I know.
Great show. This is Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Eddie Connor.
And we're going to be right back with Graham Phillips.
United States Pharmacopoeia, USP, sets the standard for most food supplements and are used in over 95% of all vitamin and mineral supplements in the world. The problem is that these products have never appeared in any living tissue. They're created in laboratories and are not recognizable to the body's metabolism. Grown by Nature products are different because they use renatured ingredients, proprietary blends of essential vitamins and minerals, with cofactors of proteins, lipids, and complex carbohydrates. Over 50 studies have been conducted on renatured nutrients, and over 20 have been published in peer-reviewed journals proclaiming their superiority. As a result, Grown by Nature vitamins and supplements are now recognized as simply the best available. Call 877-817-9829. That's 877-817-9829 and order your Grown by Nature products today. We are what we eat, and since we are of nature, we should eat foods in their natural form. Only Grown by Nature offers a full line of renatured nutrients. Call 877-817-9829. That's 877-817-9829, because not all products are grown by nature, but they should be.
Circular-shaped, unidentified objects have been reported.
The unidentified object moves slowly down the Pacific coast and disappears.
All right. Thank you, guys. We're back. This is Truth Be Told. Yes, go to truthbetoldwebtv.com. And if you guys want to go to Contact in the Desert, you can go and win tickets to Contact in the Desert just by going to our website, clicking on Win Tickets Here, and sign up, and hopefully we'll see you there. Eddie and I will be there.
That's right.
Unless it's too hot for Eddie. Eddie
Yeah,
said
and the sign-up is on the homepage.
Yeah, it's on the homepage.
Right under
we hope
the
you guys
video.
join us. So, Eddie, who do we have on the show?
We have Graham Phillips. We have GrahamPhillips.net with us. If you're just tuning in, of course, you're listening to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm Eddie Connor.
And I'm Tony Sweet.
And Graham Phillips is a historical detective and a real-life Indiana Jones. And listen, if you're just really tuning in the last 5 or 10 minutes, you can see where he really is the real-life Indiana Jones. He's passionate about everything he's speaking about. His latest book is called The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, which is the search for Camelot and the Isle of Avalon. That would be Avalon with the V. Sorry, I'm from the South, so it was Avalon. Abalone, like the shell. So we want to ask you, Graham, where is King Arthur's tomb?
Well, when I discovered what I thought was the historical Camelot, this place called Viriconium, incidentally, one might say, well, Viriconium isn't the same as Camelot, is it? Well, the name Camelot was invented in the Middle Ages by a poet who had to come up with something to rhyme with Lancelot. That is honestly true. It's like the Monty Python team and Spamalot. I mean, they had to come up with something to rhyme with. That's where, but nobody, whatever it was called, the earlier stories refer to this great capital city, but they don't give it a name. So obviously it had been forgotten in the centuries after the time Arthur lived. So when I've got a place where I could actually go to and say, okay, Arthur probably came from here. Who really did rule here around 500 AD? And in the British Library in London, there are records of the kings of that part of England. And I found that the name of the king who lived at that point, when Arthur was supposed to live, wasn't called Arthur at all. He was called Owen.
Oh.
And I thought, oh, well, this guy, Owen Thangwin was his real name. And I thought, oh, that's it, finished, done for. This is one of these times when I had one of these inspiration things you were talking about.
Yes.
I thought, I'm finished. Clearly I found the place and a man who may have probably led the Britons against the Anglo-Saxons. At the time, Arthur is said to have done so, and he probably was the man who refortified this city. But his name wasn't Arthur, so that looked like that. But then I suddenly had the inspiration to look in a book I'd already looked into, that was one of the only records that survives from that time in Britain. A work by a monk called Gildas, who wrote within living memory of that period, just a couple of decades later. And he wrote about the guy who ruled this place, but he doesn't refer to him by his name. He refers to him by a title, Ursus. Now, Ursus is Latin. He wrote in Latin for a bear, like the grizzly bear, a bear. And the thing is that many Celtic warriors at that time were given titles, battle names, to somehow represent their prowess in battle, like the cunning fox or the hound or whatever. And this guy was called the bear. And I thought, and suddenly the inspiration was look in a Welsh dictionary. I just took a Welsh dictionary, because Welsh, one of the languages spoken in the British Isles, is descended from Brythonic, the language spoken by the common people at the time Arthur is said to have lived. So I looked in a Welsh dictionary. Bear, the name for a bear in Welsh is Arth, A-R-T-H. And it was also the name I discovered later in Brythonic. Arth means bear. So the man who ruled from the most powerful city in the country at the time Arthur is supposed to have ruled from the most powerful city in the country was actually called Arth, which could easily have been developed into, Latinized into Arthur. And in other words, it seemed that nobody had found King Arthur because nobody had been looking for a man who had gone down in history under his title rather than his real name.
Wow.
And meanwhile, is some of this deliberately cryptic and some of it not deliberately cryptic? The research, I mean, you're doing the research, but I know like in the Bible, there's lots of parables and things like that. And I know like in the Bible, when it talks about the woman should follow the man and the woman should do what the man says. The husband is king, the wife is the do as I say person. And that's really code for the man or the son in the Bible, S-U-N, in the Bible is the conscious thinking mind. And the wife, the feminine, is the subconscious mind. So whatever the conscious mind tells the body or the subconscious has to make it a reality. I'm so fat today. I feel so fat today. I feel so fat today. So your subconscious is going to do everything it can to make you feel fat, fat, fat. So it's written in parables. It's written, some of it's cryptic, some of it's deliberate. In all of your research, do you find that more of it seems to be cryptic as opposed to just straightforward information?
Well, this monk called Gildas, everything he wrote, and he was a holy man supposedly of the church. He's writing about people who were pretty much pagan, and therefore he couldn't write so openly about people, perhaps because the Pope wouldn't take offence or his bishop or whatever. So, in fact, he refers to all the kings of Britain at that time. Britain had divided up after the Romans left into a lot of separate kingdoms, of which Owen Thangwyn, Arth, was just one of them. He was seemingly the most powerful. But others, he refers to all of them by their battle names, the Hound, the Lion, and other names like this, and the Wolf. In other words, he seems to be being deliberately cryptic in some ways. And when he writes about what these people did, he uses a lot of biblical references that I've still yet to try and sort out. In other words, to try and solve the full story of King Arthur, I'd have to decipher what this monk is writing about cryptically, like where he was born and so forth. But one thing I did manage to find out is where this man Owen Thangwyn was buried. Now, in one of the earliest references to King Arthur, it's a poem written about the kings of that area that ruled from Viraconium, and it tells us where they're buried. Now, this had been known about, but these people thought, okay, fine, that some kings who ruled from Viraconium are buried in this particular place. But now I'd figured out that one of them must be Arthur. He's doing everything that Arthur did. He's living in a place that Arthur, the most powerful city in the country, and his name is Arth. Then where this Owen Gwyn is buried is important because it's the burial site of Arthur, if I'm right. And it refers to it, the burial site, as the churches of Bassa. So I looked in the area on a map around Viriconium, and there's only one place that sounds anything like that, a modern village called Bass Church. Churches of Bassa, Bass Church. There's nothing else in the whole of Britain anything sounds anything like it. And just outside this modern village of Bass Church, which is about 9 miles from Viriconium, there is a fortification that was known to have been erected around 500 AD that seems to have been used for ceremonial rather than defensive purposes. And it is this basically hillock where Arthur is said to have, where the kings of Viriconium have said to have been buried. So this seems to have been, if Arthur was one of them, as I believe, he's buried there. And in fact, it says that it refers to the fact that the first of the kings of that area, Owen Gwyn, Arth, it refers to him being buried in somewhere called Travail's Acre. And there's only one place in that, near that hillock, right next to it, an acre of land surrounded by a ditch and moat built around 500 AD, which matches that description. So it seems that Arthur, if he really existed, is buried on this place called Travail's Acre at Bass Church, smack in the centre of England.
Wow! Just in plain view.
In plain view, but
it's on farmland. I mean, it's in remote countryside. So in order to basically figure out if this was real or not, I then needed to bring in archaeologists, and I managed to organize a geophysics survey of the area. That's using modern scientific equipment, including ground penetrating radar, which could produce a 3-dimensional computer generated image of what lies hidden below the ground.
What?
And right in the center of this acre of land, there was it showed that a pit had been dug 6 feet deep and about 6 feet wide, round, which was the style of burial 1,500 years ago. And right in the middle of it, they picked up a metal object, an iron object that seems to have been the central boss, the central part of a shield. And we know that at that time, warriors were often buried with their shields. So it does match a burial site of the period in question. It is where Owen Gwyn is said to have been buried, and it's the only burial in that acre of land.
Wow.
The others are obviously buried somewhere else. So if Owen Gwyn is Arthur, then I found the burial site of Arthur. I found his tomb. And the last thing that really convinced me that this Arth, the bear, Owen Gwyn was Arthur, is his father had a battle name too, and that was the terrible head dragon. Oh. And when you translate that into Brythonic, that translates as Uther Pen Dragon. And Arthur's father in the romances is said to have been Uther Pen Dragon.
Wow.
Oh.
Wow, I've learned so much today.
Oh, I know.
And what I love about you, you still have that passion. You can, where so many people, they write about something and they're kind of over it, but you still have that passion that it excites everybody that's listening to you. Just because of time, we only have about 7-8 minutes left, and I want to make sure we talk about one of the most important things that anytime you mention King Arthur is the Excalibur. Can we go ahead and talk about the Excalibur? What was it, a real sword? Was it a metaphor for something else in his life?
Well, I thought that this was going to be some fairy tale metaphor or something, and it was supposed to be probably going to be the most unlikely part of the story to be real. But it turned out that this does seem to have been based on historical, some kind of historical situation. What that was in the story of King Arthur, when he lies dying, he asks his knight to throw Excalibur, his sword, into a lake. And then the arm of the Lady of the Lake, this mysterious water nymph, rises from the water, grabs the weapon by the hilt and takes it down into the crystal depths. Now, historically, that sounds completely nuts. Right. But historically, at the time Arthur said to have lived, the Celtic people would very often, as part of a funeral rite, throw the sword of a important warrior into a sacred lake or pool as an offering to a water goddess called Vivienne. Now, this water goddess, well, obviously, maybe she didn't exist, but they would imagine her to be a spirit like the Lady of the Lake who would grab the sword Excalibur. And this is where I believe that the story of the Lady of the Lake comes, especially when the Lady of the Lake in medieval romances is referred to as Vivian.
Yes.
I think the story came from the fact that when Arthur was dying, his sword was cast into a lake as an offering, as part of the funeral rites. And right next to this hillock in the middle of where Arthur, I believe, is buried, there is a lake. And so I decided to organize a forensic marine archaeological survey of the lake. And we got somebody from Liverpool University, a forensic marine archaeologist, with a boat to go up and down the lake, measuring it with sonar and radar and everything to see if there was anything at the bottom of the lake that might be like a sword. Cutting a long story short, there seemed to be something there. Divers were sent in, underwater archaeologists, but unfortunately, when they came out, they said the water is too peat stained to do anything. And at the bottom, there's like about a 4-foot muddy sediment above the actual bed of the lake. And until there's new kind of technology, we aren't going to be able to excavate it. Maybe we'll have to even dredge the lake or bring something in that we just don't have at the moment. But there could be a sword at the bottom of this lake. And so the answer, did Excalibur exist? It seems so.
Well, I'm going to go back just for 1 second. You spoke about the monk that you were researching, the one that spoke kind of in parables and had a religious sort of overtone to it. There's a great author. His name is Dr. Joseph Murphy, and he deciphers the Bible by what the Bible really means, not what most conservative people claim that it means. And he breaks everything down, every family, every story, every parable, and what it really means. And I would check that out, Graham. I would check out Dr. Joseph Murphy. Pull up some of his things. He's got a new, he passed away, I think, in the 60s, but he has a new book that's been released that's literally thicker than the Bible. It's like a telephone book, but it has all of the breakdowns in there. And I just have this funny feeling that you're going to come across some things that answer the questions you have about what the monk was speaking about specifically.
What's his name again? Joseph. I'm sorry, I'm writing it down. Joseph Murphy.
Yes.
Dr. Joseph Murphy.
And
That's
Graham,
right.
have you ever, I mean, like Eddie, who is, an amazing psychic, have you ever worked with psychic, intuitive people to work with your research?
Yes, going back, the very first story I told you about, the search for the jewels of Mary, Queen of Scots, involved a bunch of psychic people who were having dreams about. I was solving clues, while they were coming up with dreams. So the following morning, we'd kind of meet up at the headquarters of the magazine that we ran at the time, and I'd say, "Well, I figured that this." Oh my goodness! Somebody'd say, "That's what they were just telling us they dreamt about last night."
Wow.
In fact, where we actually found this casket with this stone in it, was somebody had dreamt of the exact location before we'd even solved the clues, except they didn't know where it was, but they described an avenue of trees that was right by a river, and somebody else had a dream about a swan, and eventually it was found next to an avenue of trees by a river, a bend in the river called the Swan's Neck.
Oh.
So we followed the clues, and they were having these psychic dreams. That's happened quite a few times over the years.
That's amazing. And I had a feeling that you probably did because, like you said, all these, I think, outside forces are helping you do your research and guiding you along the way. And our time is like up, and I can't believe it went so fast. We still have so much to talk about, so I would love to throw out the invite to have you back here in the near future, because we need to find out Merlin and Holy Grail and all these other things that we'd love to talk about. So will you please come back and join us again?
I'd absolutely love to. Thank you very much for the invitation. As long as I don't have another of those clappy things.
Yeah. And in the meanwhile, if you want to learn more about Graham, please go to grahamphillips.net. Again, his newest book is called The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, The Search for Camelot and the Isle of Avalon. And remember, he's a historical detective, a real-life Indiana Jones. And as you could tell by our interview with him, he's so on point, passionate about what he speaks about, and a man on a mission to say the least. So
Well,
thank you so much,
Graham. We
Graham.
really appreciate you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, we're gonna take a little break, and then we have our second hour. But we're gonna let Graham go here, and then we are gonna be back here shortly. But if you missed the show, please go to truthbetoldwebtv.com. You can check out all of our former videos of our shows. Go to our YouTube channel at just Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie, and we are on iHeartRadio, so you can listen to our podcast and iTunes and many other places. So we really appreciate you guys joining us. I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Eddie Connor.
And you're listening to Truth Be Told right here on Universal Broadcasting Network. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.